Good afternoon. I am Zach Massetti, the 13th president of Ripon College, and welcome everyone to our historic campus. In just a few minutes, we'll hear from our speaker, Karl Rove, who was the senior advisor and deputy chief of staff during the administration of George W. Bush. A quick shout out. Today's event was organized by the Ripon College Republicans, the Pre-Law Society, and through a vote provided in funds from our Student Senate. So thank you to each group. This college and the town of Ripon have a long history of political debate and discourse. Ripon, of course, was founded by settlers from New York who came to Wisconsin in the late 1840s, just as it was becoming a state. And the people of that new community were proud to be Americans. In fact, 91,000 Wisconsinites fought for the Union during the Civil War less than a decade later. But those first settlers of Ripon were followers of the philosopher Charles Fourier, who, among other things, was an early proponent of feminism. Those settlers met in Kenosha, and then they purchased property here in Ripon. Nearly 200 people moved, and they formed a commune. They tried unsuccessfully to implement a very complicated economic plan of replacing classes for a system of credits, and that commune folded after a couple of years, but many of the members stayed in Ripon to, how shall we say, pursue more individualistic aims. In 1854, the matter of slavery was the most important issue in the country, and when the Kansas-Nebraska bill was introduced proposing the expansion of slavery based on popular vote in those territories, political debate reached a fevered pitch. The political parties, of course, included the Free Soil Party, Democrats, the Know Nothing Party, the anti-Nebraska Democrats. So enter Alvin Beauvais, and those of you, there may be some people here who live in Beauvais Hall, one of the founders of this college, a Ripon lawyer and a Democrat, and an opponent of the Kansas-Nebraska bill. An account in the first part of the 20th century about one of the people who attended that famous meeting in the Little White Schoolhouse in 1854 remembered it this way. Allen Beauvais and 16 others of us met in the little old schoolhouse. My sister was the teacher of that school, and after she had dismissed her pupils that afternoon, Beauvais arranged for the political meeting. He was the brainiest man in the entire community, and the thought of giving the proposed new political party, which would combine the elements of all parties that were opposed to the extension of slavery, the name Republican had long been in his mind. So there it is, an after-school program became the Republican Party. So this afternoon we look forward to political debate and hearing about the future of the Republican Party that was born here in Ripon in 1854. One more word. We value political speech at Ripon College. We also value courtesy and respect. And this afternoon's speaker is the second major figure in American government and politics at Ripon this year. Of course, former Director of Central Intelligence George Tenet was here earlier in the fall. And I expect that this year's commencement speaker, which you all will be hearing about in short order, will also join the tradition of what I hope will be a series of high-profile political speakers that will come to Ripon. So part of going to a great American liberal arts college is that we are going to hear some lectures we agree with and some lectures we don't agree with. But a good lecturer should make us think. Whether they alter our opinions or whether they reaffirm what we already believe is less important than getting us to think about what we believe. So I ask you to be respectful of the tradition we are beginning during the talk this afternoon. It is now my pleasure to introduce Matthew Rohrbach, a senior from Portage, Wisconsin, who is a politics and government and communications double major with double minor in national security and law and society. Matthew has put in hours organizing today's event. He has our thanks, and he will now introduce our speaker. Thank you all for being here this afternoon.
Good afternoon, everyone. Mr. President, special guests, Ripon College faculty, staff, and students, alumni, community members, and other attendees who have traveled small and far distances to attend this event, welcome to Ripon College. First, I must say thank you to President Massetti for his continued dedication and support to bring a high-profile speaker such as this one this afternoon to Ripon College. I thank you for that. I have other faculty and staff to thank, anywhere from Dr. Colucci, Professor Schassinger, Professor Steve Sorensen, Karl Rove, Melissa Anderson, Rick Dahm, Andrew McDowell, Melissa Bemis, Dean Ogle, and numerous more. In addition, I must thank Young Americans Foundation for their continued guidance and support to organize this event. Finally, I have the College Republicans and Free Law Society to thank for working with me and making this a successful event, specifically Jackie Mahalik, Logan Soich, Alex Hagan, and even though he's not here today, he's studying abroad in Washington, D.C. this semester, still deserves recognition, is Ryan Reeve. But in addition, for people who walked in, there was note cards that you could take. There will be a Q&A session immediately following a Karl Rove speech. What will happen is students from the Ripon College Republicans as well as the Free Law Society will go around and collect them. I would invite you to take the note cards and pass them to the windows side, and then one of us will come take your note cards, and then we will cipher through them and then read questions going off one by one to Mr. Rove. If there's any questions, I can address them as soon as Mr. Rove is done with his speech. But on this day, on February 6, 1911, a young American by the name of Ronald Wilson Reagan was born into this world. Without knowing his life would be a journey filled with numerous paths. But in 1980, he did not only become the President of the United States, but he also became known as the great communicator, a reputation that cannot fully describe the inspiration he was to others. 102 years later, after the birth of our 40th president, Ripon College has been given the unique opportunity to commemorate and remember his legacy by hosting one of the most influential strategic minds in political history, a man who worked on President Reagan's 1984 presidential campaign. Even though today's speaker is not the face of a political office, he has too many great men in political history, the mind behind the scenes to create the image, message, and overall impersonation of our elected officials. This man's life passion, founded when he became a member of the College Republicans as a first year at the University of Utah, has led to influencing and inspire academia in the creation of a new specializing field known as political communication. This academic inspiration has led to Ripon College's pursuit to not just be satisfied as only an establishment that values liberal arts education, but a center of communication in the Midwest where freedom of speech is championed and garnished for the betterment of its students, faculty, staff, and community members. The core of Ripon College's beliefs and traditions are inspired by its motivation and dedication to provide a dynamic education and understanding to the multiple sides of every argument. Today, we participate in the discourse that is life, a discourse that is to the great extent political. Politics shapes our everyday lives, which makes it necessary for us to increase our knowledge of it through participating in the great conversation and exchanging our ideas in an effort to understand one another. Today's speaker will present new methods for individuals to become politically active through leadership and understanding of current events that has inspired millions of people to comprehend political history and current political issues. Ripon College is proud to welcome the architect behind several successful campaigns as president of Karl Rove and Company, an Austin-based public affairs firm that worked for Republican candidates, nonpartisan causes, and nonprofit groups. His clients included over 75 Republican U.S. Senate, Congressional, and gubernatorial candidates in 24 states, as well as the Moderate Party of Sweden. Some of his most notable campaigns include, but are not limited to, several Texas Supreme Court races, to former United States Attorney General John Ashcroft's 1994 Missouri United States Senate race, to the most recognizable former President George W. Bush's 1994 Texas gubernatorial campaign and his 2000 and 2004 presidential campaigns. While in the White House, he served as senior advisor to President George W. Bush from 2000 to 2007 and deputy chief of staff from 2004 to 2007. While managing the Office of Public Affairs, the Office of Public Liaison, Office of Strategic Initiatives, Governmental Affairs, and was Deputy Chief of Staff for Policy, which coordinated the White House policy-making process. Currently, he writes weekly op-ed articles in the Wall Street Journal and is author of a New York bestseller, Courage and Consequence, My Life as a Conservative in the Fight. He has written for various publications, including the Daily Beast, Financial Times, Forbes, FoxNews.com, HumanEvents.com, The Times, Washington Post, and the Weekly Standard. It is with great honor and humility to introduce one of the most inspirational, influential, iconic political strategists of all time for his provocative and robust knowledge of all major political issues of today. Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Ripon College Republicans, the Free Law Society, and the Young Americans Foundation, we are proud to welcome Karl Rove to Ripon College campus.
Thank you, Matt, for that overly generous and incredibly long introduction. If it were true, it'd be nice, but well, first of all, thanks for having me. And I noticed a couple of snickers over here when they mentioned the moderate party of Sweden. I'm a Norwegian, so it's even funnier than I had a buddy that I met in college who was the head of the Free Moderate Studentenverbundet, which is the Free and Moderate Student Unionists, the moderate party's student arm, and he became the parliamentary leader and asked me to help get the party ready for the upcoming parliamentary election, in which he was elected the first non-socialist prime minister of Sweden in 40 years, Carl Bildt. And today, he's the foreign minister of the country after having been the European Union lead on the Balkans in the 90s. In Sweden, you may not know this, but is governed by a center-right party that has provided school choice. A quarter of the students in Sweden attend private schools where the money follows the kid, and it has one of the best economic records, one that we might try and emulate because they got robust growth, low unemployment, a debt that's under control, and government spending in check. So what's not to like about that, even though they are Swedes? I understand the Commonwealth had an interesting poll. Is Rove a genius or a hack? I appreciate them being relatively unbiased. Normally one of those words, genius or hack, would be prefaced with the word evil. I don't know which part of the scale you wanted to put your thumb on. You know, evil genius, I used to read that in the newspapers. You know, Cheney used to say he was Darth Vader. I used to have to correct him. I said, no, I'm Darth Vader, you're the Sith Lord. Anyway, I'm delighted to be here. I'm honored to see a friend of mine. I was looking around, he was sitting right behind me, a graduate of Ripon College, Judge Michael O'Boren of Waukesha County. I've got a little bit more to say about him later, but Judge, thanks for coming over.
Good to see you.
He's unopposed on the ballot this spring, so you don't need to worry about voting for him if you're from Waukesha, but you know, every vote will help, even though he doesn't have an opponent. It'd be nice to just sort of reaffirm Mike. But I'm going to talk a little bit more about him. I'm delighted you came over, Mike. Awfully nice of you to do so. I've been asked to talk about two things. I've been asked to talk about how do you get involved in politics as a young person, and then why in the heck should you ever contemplate such a silly act? I'm going to do that, I hope, in about another 28 minutes and 12 seconds, and then I'm going to answer duck your questions until you're bored and I run out of BS. But actually, it's an interesting thing. I mean, how can you get involved? Makes it sound like it's some strange and difficult thing to plunge into politics in America. And you know, in some countries it is a difficult thing to get involved, but in the United States of America, one of the great things is, if you've got a passion for politics, guess what? It's open to you. If you have an interest in politics, you can plunge right in. It's one of these sort of equal opportunity, things that's running around. You want to do it, you can do it. You can get involved in a campaign, you can run them. I ran my first congressional campaign when I was 23 years old. Virginia Haven Smith, 3rd District in Nebraska. We won a huge victory. 174 votes. Landslide, Virginia. You can serve in government. You've got a professor here who is a young man, entered the Foreign Service, served in the State Department. You can run for office. Mike, he's a college Republican buddy of mine. He ran for office. You can help others run for office. You can get involved in a cause or a group that you care deeply about. But America, de Tocqueville wrote about this in the 1830s, as a nation of voluntary associations. We seem to have a natural appetite that if we care about something, no matter how esoteric it is, you know, some weird philosopher's theory about commune living, people move from New York to Wisconsin, buy some land, and try it out for a while. So it's not a difficult thing to do. If you want to do it, do it. Have the courage, and if you got the passion, to jump right in. Sort of how I got involved. Look, I didn't come from a particularly political family. My dad, this will surprise you, was from Fox Point, Wisconsin. He was a geologist. He's like a lot of people in the upper Midwest. He didn't say much, kept things to himself, and looked at his shoes a lot. I never knew how my dad voted in politics until he was in his 70s. And he told me he was going to vote for Arnold Schwarzenegger for governor of California. Total shock and surprise. I never knew how he voted. My mother was completely apolitical. One year she was so proud I was working in the Republican campaign, she told me that she voted straight Republican. 2 years later, my older brother was in love with Eldridge Cleaver, who was running for president on the Peace and Freedom Party, and my mother told him she was going to vote straight Peace and Freedom Party for him. She was not exactly a pretty deep thinker. And we never talked politics around the kitchen table. We just didn't. And yet, as long as I can remember, I've been interested in politics. But it's sort of that interest. Look, I put a Nixon bumper sticker on my bicycle and rode it up and down the street. Till the little girl across the street, who had about 30 pounds and 3 years on me, pulled me off the bicycle and beat the crap out of me. Gave me a bloody nose. And I've never liked losing almost more than I like winning in politics ever since. But I didn't know what to do with it until I got into high school. I was about this tall, and I had a high squeaky voice, and I wore hush puppies when they weren't cool, and I carried around a briefcase, and I kid you not, I had a pocket protector. And I was on the debate team. Talk about a nerd. And I had a teacher. Like Mike, he was, prone to wear bow ties. Eldon Tolman. He was everything I wasn't. I somehow ended up being a Republican. But he was a Democrat. The local head of the Utah Education Association, and a fussy little guy, loved Lyndon Johnson, supported the Vietnam War, neither of which I agreed with. And, but he saw something. He said, Mr. Rove, he was very formal, sort of like Bill O'Reilly, Mr. Rove. He said, if you want to get an A in this class, everyone else can get an A by satisfactory completion of the coursework. I remember his exact words, satisfactory completion of the coursework. But he said, if you want an A, you must get involved in a political campaign. He knew I had an interest, and he wanted to light a spark to it. He didn't care I didn't think like he did. He just wanted to encourage participation. And I wanted the A. That's about all I had. So I went and got involved in a campaign. I remember the day I walked into the headquarters. There's a guy there, and he said, what do you want to do? I said, well, I want to volunteer. I go to this high school, and I want to volunteer in the campaign. And he said, well, the campaign manager would probably like to see you. Sit right here. And a few minutes later, I walked in the door, and there was this fellow, and he talked to me a little bit about what I wanted to do. And he said, well, here's the deal. I'm going to make you chairman of the campaign for your high school. And I want you to bring a bunch of kids back next weekend to work at the headquarters. And we made signs or whatever. A couple weeks later, he said, you've done such a good job, I'm going to make you the chairman of the county for high school students for our candidate. And I had a heck of a fun time in the course of the rest of the campaign. All because my teacher said, get an A, and I walked in the headquarters, and this fellow said, I'm going to give you some responsibility and see how well you do. Several decades later, I'm sitting in the West Wing of the White House, and I get to call up this guy, Tom Corlovis, who had gone on to be the chief of staff to a United States Senator, and then had become an influential guy in Washington, D.C., and had volunteered to help 5 presidents on Supreme Court and cabinet nominations. He would literally not take a dime. He'd step away. He would spend 6 or 7 months at a time in order to help shepherd through this nomination. Gave the most candid advice to 5 different Republican presidents that a human being could be counted on to give. And I got to call him and say, Tom, do you remember that day that I came in the headquarters and you gave a 16-year-old kid a chance? He said, yeah. What are you calling me for? I said, I'm calling you because my boss, the President of the United States, has asked me to call you and ask if you would serve your country as ambassador to Belgium. It's a great moment for me. Pay back the guy who helped me out. But it's a lesson of how open the process is. After I was involved in high school, I got to go back and I was offered a job in a campaign in Illinois. I'm in Utah. Illinois is slightly different. Utah is like stuck in 1953. Everybody's polite and nice to each other. I went to a high school that was 95% LDS. I was a Presbyterian. Only in Utah could a Presbyterian and a Jew both be Gentiles at a high school. So I went back to Illinois, and one of the people I met was Mike, the Midwestern College Republicans. And after being involved in a campaign in Illinois, I got a job in Washington, D.C. I was 20 years old, working as the executive director of the College Republican National Committee. After a couple of years of that, Mike and a bunch of other guys, whom he knows, John Zamitis and Bernie Robinson, said, you know, we're the old guys. We're 25 and 26. Let's get the young guy to be the next chairman of the College Republicans. And Mike and some of his buddies arranged for me to be made chairman of the College Republicans, which was like the youth revolution. My predecessor, my boss, was a lawyer in New York. He graduated from law school and passed the New York bar, and he was the chairman of the College Republicans. He became chairman when his predecessor had to resign because he became the special assistant to the Undersecretary of Defense for International Security Affairs, G. Warren Nutter. So these were the old guys. And suddenly they said, we want to turn it over to the Young Turks. And I got elected. I had a guy that I'd known over the telephone who became my Southern campaign chairman. He's a young guy from South Carolina. We hadn't met, but Mike's counterpart in South Carolina, an old guy who was about 27 years old, said to my guys, this young guy will endorse Rove. He was already going to endorse me, but he'll endorse Rove if Rove agrees to name him his Southern campaign chairman, which meant nothing. And if he campaigns in the South, he agrees that he'll take this guy with him. Easy deal to make, because we liked each other. He was sort of a nerd in high school too, but he had a different aspiration than getting an A. He wanted to get a date. So he figured out the way to get a date was to learn how to play the guitar. And so he taught himself how to play guitar and could play South Carolina beach music. And he loved rhythm and blues. And his name was Lee Harvey Atwater. So Atwater and I had known each other for a year, but never met. And I was going to go campaign in the South. And so I called him up and I said, look, I'm going to go campaign in the South. I'm going to rent a car and drive through the South. This is the week I'm going to do it. You want to go with me? He said, yeah. So I took the overnight train from Washington, D.C. to Columbia, South Carolina, because it was cheaper than an airplane. And I was met at the airport by Lee and his mentor, who was driving like a 1956 Cadillac with wings. You got going about 40 miles an hour, and the thing looked like it was going to lift off. You may remember, you know who I'm talking about. And Lee, they picked me up at the train station. We drove to the airport, and on my Gulf Oil Company credit card, I rented a Ford Pinto. And Atwater and I got in and drove through the South for a week, and I've never had so much fun in my life. He was about the weirdest human being you could ever imagine. First of all, he loved the girls. So the first place we went was Agnes Scott College outside of Atlanta, because that was where the chairman of the Georgia College Republicans went to school. It was an all-girls school, and Atwater wanted to spend a lot of time with her because she was really cute. But she said, I'm for you, and I'll vote for you, and I'll try and get my successor, who's going to be in office by the time of the convention, to vote for you. She's the ABC anchor in Richmond, Virginia today. We still stay in touch. The next day, we went to Gainesville, Florida, to meet the Florida chairman, slept on his floor in his dorm. He later became a state representative, a state senator, was termed out, and is now back in the state house after sitting out the requisite number of years. A complete jerk. But he supported me. And then we drove to Montevallo, Alabama, a young law student at the University of Alabama was the outgoing chairman. He said, I've lined up the new guy to be for you. I can't be at the meeting, but you got to be at the University of Montevallo at 8 a.m. in the morning. I'm taking some exams, and I'm trying to get out of law school, and I can't be there, but I've lined up my successor. Be there at 8 a.m., which meant we had to get up at like 4 o'clock in the morning to get there from Gainesville, and we're driving through the wiregrass of southeastern Alabama, the wiregrass country they call it, and we stop for breakfast. And I order eggs and bacon, and Atwater orders cornflakes and pours Tabasco sauce on it. I've never been able to eat cornflakes ever since. Well, we go to Montevallo, and the Alabama guy says, my outgoing chairman, my mentor, is for you, and I'm for you. And I called up the law student. His name is Jefferson Davis Sessions, and he's now the United States Senator from Alabama and ranking Republican on the Senate Budget Committee. We then drove over to Pontotoc, Mississippi. We were going to a little town in Mississippi, and the Chancery Judge, it's a big position in small town out in Mississippi, was an old line Democrat, red-necked, yellow dog Democrat, who'd sent his boy off to the University of Mississippi, and his boy had become a radical. He'd become a Republican. And we sat in the judge had gone out that day to shoot quail. And so it was the first time I ever had quail. I'm now a big, huge quail hunter. First time I ever had quail. Sitting across the table from a young guy my age named Roger Wicker, now the junior senator from Mississippi. And then we left. We spent too much time there. We were supposed to be in Little Rock, Arkansas the next morning at an historically black college that was going to host the College Republican State Convention, because the governor of the state, Winthrop Rockefeller, was a racial moderate and had knit together a coalition of Republicans and blacks, the two most outcast groups in Arkansas at that time, and had won the governorship. So we went to this college. So we had to leave. We left late. We're driving along in the middle of the piney woods of northern Mississippi at about 10:30 or 11 o'clock at night. Atwater's behind the wheel. He's got some rhythm and blues station out of Memphis, 50,000 watt station, and he's wailing away to B.B. King. B.B. King sang a hell of a lot better than Atwater did. But we're driving along, and in the middle of the nowhere, we run out of gas. Neither one of us had looked at the gas gauge, and we'd run out of gas. And off in the dim woods, there's this light, and Atwater said, hey, get behind the wheel when I come back, get ready to go. Disappears in the woods. 15 minutes later, comes running at full tilt out of the woods with a gas can, throws the gas in it, throws the gas can into the ditch, and off we go. I never asked him where he got it. We had so much fun that when I got elected College Republican National Chairman, I said, Lee, I want you to be my executive director. And he said, okay. So we were in the sub-basement of the Republican National Committee, the floor underneath the parking garage. About 5 o'clock, the carbon monoxide would come down there. The printing shop was across the way, and the janitors, that was it, with the janitors and the college Republicans in the print shop, underneath the parking garage. And the first day we were there, we were summoned by the chairman of the Republican National Committee, a tall, courtly Texan, to come up and visit with him. His name was George Herbert Walker Bush. And I was 22 years old, and Atwater was a few months older than I was, and we went up to visit with Mr. Bush, who gave us a lecture about behave, don't overspend your budget, don't get into trouble, tell us what you're going to do, we're going to give you assignments, we expect you to do them. Could have been more nice, but more pointed. Don't screw it up. At the end of our brief conversation, Atwater said, Mr. Bush, I got a question. Bush said, what is it, Lee? He said, is it true you have a boat on the Potomac? Bush said, well, yeah, I do. A Boston whaler with 2 having rooms? Yeah. Could I borrow it this weekend? There's this real good-looking girl coming up from South Carolina, and it would really impress her, and I know the kind of boat, and I promised to return it full of gas. We'd met this guy 10 minutes before. And had just enough chutzpah that Bush said, okay. I kid you not. That weekend, up from South Carolina comes Sally Atwater, the woman he married. First date was on George W. Bush's boat on the Potomac. 2 months later, Mr. Bush asked me to come to work for him. And I've always been indentured every year thereafter to somebody named Bush. But my point is this. You know, look, I liked politics. All it took was walking in the door. And I've had a wonderful life doing exactly what I want to do. I moved to Texas. They hunted Republicans with dogs when I moved there. We had gone a brief period of time without electing a Republican governor or a statewide elected official. A brief period of time. 114 years. There were 150 members of the Texas House of Representatives. There were 13 Republicans. I went to work for the senior Republican in the House. We had doubled our numbers in the 31-member state Senate in the most recent election. We'd gone from 1 to 2. Walter Mad Dog Maiden and O.H. Ike Harris. This past weekend, I got a notice from somebody. The first Republican elected to the Texas House of Representatives between 1872 and 1962 died. That's how Democrat this state was. The only guy, the first guy to break that string of losses. And I just happened to be there at the right time at the right place. And now Texas is about as red a state as it could be. I was the campaign manager, the executive director of Texans for Reagan Bush at the age of 29, big state like Texas. Started my own consulting firm, deputy chief of staff to the first Republican governor in 114 years. Ran his re-election campaign. He got defeated for re-election, and 4 years later came back to run again, and I ran his re-election campaign. And during all this course of time, I'd kept in touch with a family named Bush. I'd run President Bush 41's pre-presidential political action committee, a thing called the Fund for Limited Government. I was 27 years old. And for most of its 18-month existence, I was the staff. I was it. Our chairman was a young lawyer from Houston named James A. Baker III. Our finance chairman was Johnny Bush, and our principal spokesman was George H.W. Bush. And we spent most of those 18 months in little airplanes flying around the country and schlepping our bags from meeting to meeting and getting ready to run for president. And I look back now and say, how did it all start? Because I had a teacher who said, get involved. I ended up officing in the West Wing of the White House. In fact, my office on the second floor of the White House, where I was for the first 4 years, was Hillary Clinton's office before me. It's now occupied by Valerie Jarrett. My second office was on the first floor of the White House in what used to be the original Oval Office. The original Oval Office, when the West Wing was first built, was on the first floor. And that was where my office was, about 15 steps from the real Oval Office in the southeast corner of the building. But it all started because somebody said, want an A. And I think about my friends, Mike, a judge, Roger and Jeff, United States Senators. Got a buddy who was on the Ohio Supreme Court, Bob Cupp, just got defeated. Got a friend who's the Chief Justice of the North Dakota Supreme Court. Got about a half a dozen friends who've been in Congress, and dozens of friends who went home and served in the legislature, or became a mayor, or served on their county council, or served on the city council, or became a city manager, or just cared about politics enough to stay involved in, most of the time, the Republican Party, though we've lost a few of them to the Democrats. But that's my point. If you want to be involved in politics, if you've got a passion for it, it's easy to get involved. And you ought to be involved if you're a young person. Because your life is going to be affected by it. It already has been, by the quality of our education system. And your life is going to be affected by the quality of the policies that our government adopts or doesn't adopt. Size and cost of government is going to ultimately be translated into a debt. Right now, you owe a bill. Reach in your wallet, pull out a check, and write one for $52,273.27, because that's the share you have today of the United States debt. Every American has that amount of debt. And it's going to get bigger. And you have to pay interest on it every year when it's not reduced. The economy. We've had the worst recovery of any recovery since World War II. Since the end of the recession in June of 2009, we've had an average of 1.9% growth per quarter. This year it's anticipated to be 1.4%. And what does that mean? That means a lot of people are not enjoying the prosperity that our country once offered. We're creating jobs at an anemic rate. At the current rate of job creation of last year, it will take us 18 months more to get back to the level of jobs that we had in this country in December of 2007 when the recession began. 18 months more until we get back to the level. It has never taken as long for us to recover as it has this time. And in the meantime, by the 18 months from now, from December of 2007 till that point, somewhere between 7.9 and 10.3 million people will have entered the workforce without a job available to them. And guess what? Most of those people are going to be people like you. Getting out of school with a degree in accounting and lucky to be waiting tables. A single mom saying, I'm going to return to the workforce. Somebody returning, looking for a better job. They're just simply not going to be there. We cannot, as a great country, afford to leave so many people behind by having an economy that's grown so slowly. Manufacturing jobs. Do you know how long it's going to take at the current rate of job creation for us to get back to the same level of manufacturing jobs that we had in 2007? At the rate of jobs we were creating last year, 15,000 a month, it's going to take us 12 more years. Oh, there are going to be plenty of jobs in the service industries, but the level of manufacturing job creation is simply inadequate for our great country. Healthcare. Oh, we got this wonderful thing called the Affordable Care Act, and I want to thank you in advance for what you're doing for me and everybody else in this room who's older and less healthy. Because in the Affordable Care Act, there's a provision called community rating, which limits how much they can charge older, less healthy people by limiting how little they can charge younger, healthier people. So as a result, you, as a young person, are going to pay higher insurance rates than you would otherwise pay in order to subsidize my insurance rates. And then you're going to be stuck with the tab for the Affordable Care Act. You may have seen there was a little notice yesterday from the CBO. Probably didn't make much of it. It said, well, we think 7 million people are going to lose their existing employer-provided coverage. Let's wind back this tape a little bit. The first 10-year cost of the Affordable Care Act scored by the Congressional Budget Office in February of 2010 was just basically $1 trillion, just over $1 trillion. $500 billion for the so-called exchanges, that is subsidies to provide insurance to people who don't otherwise have it, and $500 billion, $500 billion for an expansion of Medicaid, which is already chewing up the Wisconsin state budget. The $500 billion for the exchanges was going to cover 24 million people. 21 million people who did not have existing coverage, and 3 million people who are anticipated to be dropped from their existing employer-provided coverage. So what that said yesterday was, it ain't going to be 24 million, it's going to be 28 million. Now that's what the CBO is saying. We now have a raft of private studies. The lowest one is 33 million people losing their existing coverage, up to 60, 70, one of them is 111 million. The consensus appears to be around 75 million people losing their existing employer-provided coverage. Now what does that mean? If we're spending $500 million to cover 24, how much are we going to have to spend to cover an additional 30 million, or 40 million, or 50 million, or 60 million? You do the math. And remember, the cost of the Affordable Care Act is spread over 10 years. 4 years, 10, 11, 12, 13, during which very little money is spent, 14 and 15 in which it's ramped up, and then 16, 17, 18, and 19 in which it's fully operating. We spend 85% of the money under the Affordable Care Act in those last 4 years. We spend 10 years collecting it, and then we blow it out. So you can imagine what the next 10 years of the Affordable Care Act looks like, particularly if the number of people who lose their employer-provided coverage is significantly more than the 3 million people that the Obama administration and the CBO told us it would be when they passed the law. And who's going to get stuck with the bill? Guess what? You. In fact, we have these three great social safety nets, Medicaid, Medicare, and Social Security, which are going broke. Medicaid is now, in many states, the biggest part of the budget. More than education, more than higher education, more than public safety, more than parks, more than anything else. The trustees of Medicare last April said that the hospital portion of Medicare is going belly up, broke, by 2024. And that Social Security will go belly up in 2036. Now, I'm going to be about 85 years old then and drooling out of the corner of my mouth. And I don't think I'll really care much when Social Security goes belly up. But you're going to be stuck with a tab. And at least when it comes to Social Security, when they wrote the law in the 30s, they put into place a process by which you deal with bankruptcy. It says overnight, benefits to those on Social Security will be cut to match the revenue stream, which means in 2036, people who depend upon Social Security will lose 25% of their income overnight. Now, see, that's good news because there's no description in the Medicare law of what happens when the Medicare Hospital Trust Fund goes belly up in 2024. And these systems on which so many people depend are going broke for one fundamental reason. We have made a series of promises which we cannot keep. The average person in this room is putting $109,000 into Medicare through Medicare taxes over the course of your working career and will take out $330,000 in services and pass the difference on to our kids and our grandkids, particularly young people here today. And if we're going to do anything about it, it's going to require people getting involved. Now, you may have a different view of it. You may have a different idea about how to resolve the problem you consider it to be a problem, but it's ultimately going to be resolved through the public life of our country by electing people to office who will choose one course or another. Now, Mike Bourne and I had a friend in college Republicans named Donald Schroeder, whom I suspect Mike remembers. His nickname was Duck. I've never figured out why he got that nickname. I don't want to ask. He now teaches political science at a little college in North Carolina. I haven't seen him in years. But back then, when we were in college Republicans, he was sort of a philosophical kind of a guy, and he had a law. He said, Schroeder's law was, your ability to be effective in politics is in a direct relationship to your ability to say no. And he had a corollary, which is your ability to say no depends upon, is in a direct inverse relationship to how much money you need to derive from politics. Now, he said that when we were, I suspect drinking too much beer, but it stuck with me. And you know what? He's right. Your ability to be effective in politics is in a direct relationship to your ability to say no. No, I'm not going to work for that candidate, or no, that's not the direction to go. And sometimes, and I've learned this painfully, your ability to say no depends on how easy it is to walk away from it. So my advice is this: if you like politics and you want to be involved in politics, get a degree, better yet, get a graduate degree, and follow your passion, whatever it is. Law, business, service, whatever it is. And then make time for politics. Because there'll always be, go to the place you want to live. I hate these people who say, I'm 23, I'm going to run for Congress when I'm 26, and by 30 I'm going to be the United States Senator, I'm going to be president when I'm 43. Life doesn't work out that way. Better to go to where you want to be and do what you want to do and then make time for politics, because wherever you are, there's a chance to follow your passion. Anyway, I'm the last person in the world to give good life advice. I mean, I've had a great time. Look, the average tenure of a senior White House aide is 18 months. I love all this gnashing of hands and, oh God, President Obama's losing aides. Look, it's like working, it's like drinking from a fire hose 24 hours a day. I got to be there nearly 7 years and work for a man I have great respect and admiration and affection and love for, doing things that were consequential in a time of difficulty. Look, I'm the guy that at 8:48 a.m. on a bright September morning walked over to the President of the United States and said, Mr. President, a plane has flown into the World Trade Center. We don't know if it's commercial or prop, jet or private. I spent 9/11 with him. I was in the motorcade to the airport. Normally, the presidential motorcade There's a thing called the spare in the front. That's a spare limousine. And then there's the presidential limousine. It was then codenamed Stagecoach. And then there's a vehicle full of heavily armed people. Don't mess with them. Then there's a car that's called Control, which has got sophisticated communications gear and a military aide carrying a funny-shaped brown-black briefcase with nuclear codes in it. And then there's the counter-assault team, even more heavily armed guys. Don't mess with them. And right behind that was the vehicle I was generally in, but not that day. We got ready to go to the airport. The boss whistled at me and pointed to get in the Stagecoach with him. Presidential motorcade goes generally 40 or 45 miles an hour to the airport. That day we went at 85 miles an hour. We were sitting there in the car, not saying much, and the phone rang, and the president took a call. And I could only hear one side of the conversation, but I knew it was a bad call when he said, "Is Rumsfeld alive?" He got word of the strike on the Pentagon. And I remember when he said that, I just instinctively had to look away from him, and I looked out the window of Stagecoach and realized we're going 85 miles an hour, and if I could have rolled down the window, which you can't, there was a police car a foot away from us matching our speed. And I realized suddenly there was a police car on either side of us and in front and back of us matching our speed exactly as we went to the airport. Never saw it before and never saw it again. Later that day, I said to Eddie Morenzo in a quiet moment on Air Force One, I said, "Eddie, what was it with the police cars?" He said, everybody knew where the president was. He said, "We're afraid that there would be a car bomb, so we've positioned the police cars around the vehicle so that if a car bomb attempted to intercept the motorcade, it would force the bomb to go off 7 or 8 feet further away from the vehicle and give the president a better chance of surviving." I'm thinking, what the hell am I doing at Stagecoach? I've had a great life. I get to go on Fox. I get to write a column every week for the Wall Street Journal. I mean, that's just amazing to me. I'm sitting here saying, what the heck? I get to write in one of the world's greatest newspapers every single week. My contract says you have to write 50 weeks a year. You can have 2 weeks off, and we'll give you 2 more weeks off if you give us advance notice. I've been writing since March of 2008, and I've never taken a week off. I went on my honeymoon and I wrote. Because I didn't want to miss a chance to participate in the great drama of America's democracy. And you got a chance to do it too, in whatever way, shape, or form you want to pursue it. So when they said, we want you to talk about how to get involved in politics and why you should, I said, this is going to be the easiest darn speech I've given in months. Because this is not complicated. Anyway, thanks for having me here today. I'd be happy to answer your questions. Look, I don't care how tough the questions are. I know some of you out there saying, he is a hack. Somebody said, yes, he may be a genius, but he's evil. Fine, okay, great. Write your questions. Don't write swear words. This is a polite community made of upper Midwesterners. We don't like to swear. We look at our shoes. We're polite. We say hello to each other. But anyway, thanks for having me here today, and I appreciate your help. Hand them to the outside. They'll have some people wandering up and down the hall, the aisles, and picking them up.
I promise this question will not take as long as my introduction, Karl. But given the Bush administration's authorization on the use of interrogation techniques like waterboarding that are mostly certainly illegal under the Convention Against Torture, and the obligation to investigate and prosecute such violations isn't the U.S. government's continued failure to do so a flagrant violation of international law. Since valid treaties are the supreme law of the land, doesn't the government have a legal obligation to investigate and, as appropriate, prosecute former officials, such as yourself, who may have had roles in decisions and policies and actions?
Yeah. Well, first of all, it wasn't torture. And the legal counsel, the lawyers at the Office of Legal Counsel, John Wu, Steve Bradbury, and Judge Jay Bybee, looked at these matters very carefully. These memos are now available publicly, and I encourage you to read them. Like waterboarding. You'd be amazed at how much, first of all, you had to have a doctor present, and you had to tell the terrorist, this will not kill you. You had to have a psychiatrist there in order to ascertain whether or not mental harm was being created on this individual. You had to use water of a certain temperature, distilled water. You had to explain the procedure in advance to them. I mean, we had this thing of slamming people against walls. Did you know the walls had to be carefully constructed? We consulted people in Hollywood about how to construct a wall so people wouldn't be hurt. I mean, these things were, I know how people toss around the word torture. We were very serious about looking at our commitments and our responsibilities under U.S. law and international commitments and tailoring programs for us that got us the ability to extract information from these people, to break their will. The most important thing was not to, look, you say to somebody, you waterboard them once or twice, they're going to tell you anything, and you can't trust a bit of it. The object, though, was to break their will. And when we finally broke Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, he thanked him. He thanked his interrogators. He said, I've met my responsibility. I can't take this any longer. I will tell you anything. Thank you for our code tells us only so far. You've taken me only so far. I'm going to cough it up. And without it, I will tell you this. We would not have gotten Osama bin Laden in Abbottabad when we did. Because what happened is this. We had a piece of information about a courier named Al-Arabi. That was his code name. And two sophisticated interrogators who had previously interrogated Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and another high-value target asked them about Al-Arabi. And both of them said, unimportant, nothing, minor functionary. These guys go to then CIA Director Hayden and say, you know what? Both these guys say no. But there's just something about the way they say no that causes us to believe this guy is somebody. We've interrogated these guys, we've gotten to know them, we've gotten inside their head. There's just something about this that causes us to believe this guy is somebody and they're trying to hide it from us. They finally track down Al-Arabi, find his real name. This is not like picking up a phone book in Islamabad and running your finger down a page. So they find the real guy. They trace all of his relationships. They find that his brothers bought property in Abbottabad. They go in and physically look at the facility and say, this place looks like something you do if you were hiding somebody. And the result is that we got Osama bin Laden. It would not, we'd get him eventually, but we got him when we did because of high-value targets coughing up information. And look, if this was torture, the questioner is right. If this were torture, then President Obama has a moral responsibility to go after those people. And he would have, if it had met the test of the law. But these lawyers very carefully understood what could and could not be done. And this kept us safe. I can't tell you about the details. I'm sure I don't know a fraction of the details, but I do know this. The information we got from these targets kept us safe. It helped us foil plots. It helped us find the leadership of Al-Qaeda. And it provides, even today, a continuing series of information sources that allow President Obama to keep us safe. Now, look, I know it's unpopular. I know it's controversial. But I'm comfortable with the judgment of history on this. And if you have any doubt about the memos, go to them. I've got them on my website, Rove.com. They're buried in there. But you can find them online and read them. And see if you don't, this is not sort of, how can we just make the pain and anguish and torture these people? It is how can we go about extracting information in a way that is in conformity with laws and international obligations. Matt, stay up here.
The Tea Party movement has demonized bipartisanship, championing candidates who are uncompromising in their positions and attitudes, further polarizing politics, creating gridlock, and resulting in a Congress whose public approval rating is the lowest ever. What will be the tipping point that will thrust more, my apologies, I can't. Thrust more, as you put it, electable candidates back into the fore?
Yeah, look, I don't blame, I don't agree with the depiction of Tea Party. I just don't. I think you got to distinguish between two different things. Here's the Tea Party sentiment. It's a big thing. here's the Tea Party movement. The Tea Party movement is the political manifestation of this bigger sentiment. Most of the people that I meet who agree with the Tea Party sentiment are decent Americans who have, most of them, little previous political involvement, and they're deeply concerned about the course of the country, particularly its deficits and debt and spending and the Affordable Care Act and the intrusion of government into their lives, and they want something done about it. Now, you do have the Tea Party movement, which is where we spend most of our time looking. We don't look at the sentiment. We spend most of our time looking at the movement. And the movement consists of a couple of different elements. Most of the movement are people who say, we don't want to be an adjunct of either party. We want to be like the pro-life movement or the civil rights movement or the pro-gun movement and hold the feet of politicians in both parties to the fire over these issues that we care about. I admit there's some elements of the Tea Party which are different. You know, we've got a political action committee founded by a political consultant. And geez, we raise money through a direct mail fundraising firm that I control. And we give the contracts for the activity, the television ads and radio ads and activity that we do to a company controlled by my wife. And this is a great way to make a living. I got a website called Tea Party in the name, and I'm going to raise money. There's one of these. I was looking at it the other day. No idea who's behind it. They got a little functionary as the treasurer of it, but they raised $400,000 last election cycle, spent $300,000 of it in one campaign in Virginia, and $26,000 in this race, and $20,000 in this race. I mean, contests that are costing millions of dollars, and this group is raising it, and God knows what percentage, 95% of what they raise goes to pay their overhead, and they're putting a pittance out there. But that's not the Tea Party. The Tea Party that we ought to be paying attention to is the sentiment of these people who say, enough is enough, we can't keep spending this way. And the Tea Party movement, at least the professional Tea Partiers, are going to run out their string because they can only make hay for so long. But most of the Tea Party is grappling with how do we make ourselves durable over the long haul in order to encourage politicians in both parties to pay attention to these issues. And the Tea Party sentiment that's concerned about deficit, debt, and spending is not going away. Not when the country is in the condition that it's in. Think about this. On January 9th, 2009, the public debt of the United States, that's the part of the debt that's been securitized in the form of a bond that's sold to somebody. Here's the debt, here's the public debt. Most economists focus on the public debt because it's a bond. Somebody in China or somebody in Europe or somebody here at home has bought that treasury bond and it bears our name on it. It's got your name on it. It says that you and we and everybody in the United States of America are going to pay this money back with interest. On January 20th, 2009, the public debt of the United States was equal to 40% of GDP. It had averaged in the previous 8 years 36% of GDP, down from where it was under Clinton, down from where it was under 41, down from where it was under Reagan, down from where it was under any president going back to Harry S. Truman. Peaked after World War II under Truman and been coming down since then. 40% on January 20th, 2009. By the end of 2009, it stood at 54% of GDP. By the end of 2010, 62% of GDP. By the end of 2011, 71% of GDP. By the end of this year, it'll be at 74% of GDP. We're in the level of Greece. And as long as we're keeping spending like that, running up these deficits, this issue of spending, deficits, debt, the Affordable Care Act, entitlement reform, what's the country doing, how big is the government, it's not going to go away.
Given that you're at the birthplace of the Republican Party, do you have a message to launch a rebirth of the party?
Yeah, look, every time either party gets beat, they gotta retool. If they don't, they go the direction of the Whigs. Or the anti-Masonic Party. Or the Prohibitionists. I'm reading an interesting book about the election of 1896. Did you know the Prohibitionists split in the 1896 election? Between the broad-gauged and the narrow-gauged factions. That's what they call themselves, the broad-gauged and the narrow-gauged. Look, if after you lose, you better figure out why you lost and do something about it. And the Republican Party lost in the last election because, look, we're supposed to be the party that wins on taxes. Our advantage on taxes dwindled away. 59% of the American people said the #1 issue facing the country was the economy, and we won on that issue, but only by 51-47. Most people thought Romney's economic policies would only benefit the rich. Guess what? That's what they think about Republicans all the time. That's what they thought about Ronald Reagan in 1984. But this election was different. You know what happened? People who thought that Romney's policies mostly benefited the rich broke for Barack Obama by 81-17. Obviously, we failed to say they'll benefit you too. You know, Latinos, they go to church more often than the rest of the population. They volunteer for military service more than at a higher percentage than any other group in America. This will blow your mind. They're more likely to create a business than virtually any other group in America. They're entrepreneurial. They're strongly pro-life, many of them, and they're church-going people. And they have families, and they're concerned about the education of their kids because they see education as the path to upward mobility. And in Texas, they vote Republican. Last time around, we got 27%. Interestingly enough, we got 32% in the battleground states. Did you know that? Romney ran better. He got 42% of the Latino vote in Ohio, ground zero. Proven that if you do run a campaign among them, talking about jobs, economy, deficit, debt spending, getting the country going again, you can do better than if you simply talk to them about self-deportation. But we better do something to get right with the Latino community. I had a really interesting experience that has never left me. In 1997, Bush was thinking about getting ready to run for president, so we were laying the groundwork by going around the country talking to people that could help raise money. We're out in Orange County, California, and one of our local friends had said, I want you to speak to this business leaders group. In order to be a member of this group, you had to be like the president, CEO, chairman of the board of a company with like, you know, I don't know, sales of $50 million a year, something like that. I mean, these were good, these were movers and shakers. I'm sitting next to this attractive Latino guy. He says to me, I'm a 7th generation Californian. His family had come there in 1820 when it was still ruled by Spain. He said, I've always been a Republican. He said, my family's always been Republican. He said, my great-great-great-grandfather was secretary-treasurer of the California Republican Party when Ulysses S. Grant was president. He said, I'm not certain I'm a Republican anymore because Pete Wilson ran those ads showing all those Mexicans running up Interstate 5, and it made it sound like people like me are like that. Druggies, illegals, criminals. He said, it's a matter of respect for the community. You want to meet some hard asses on immigration? Go to the heavily Hispanic communities along the Texas-Mexico border. They know what the lack of border security is doing, but they want us to do something to resolve the status of the people who are already here. And they want to have a guest worker program so that people like them can come over here and pick the onions and work in the chicken plants. And look, let's be honest about it. There are a lot of jobs that Americans won't do. And sometimes it doesn't matter how much we pay them. I was talking to a fruit grower in Washington State. He needs 1,500 people to bring in his crop in a very short period of time. And he generally gets about 500 people. You know how much he pays? $24 an hour. And he can't get people to show up because it's manual labor in a field. So we better get right on this issue. It's one of the things we need to do. But the biggest thing we need to do as a party is become a reform conservative party that has ideas that we advocate with passion and authenticity that will solve the problems of the future. How do we get the economy growing more robustly? How do we put people back to work? How do we mend these social safety nets before it's too late? How do we put the country in better fiscal shape? And you got a couple of guys in the state who are helping lead the country. This is not, you know, we're not the Democrats. We don't have the White House, so we don't have one guy. They got one guy. For good or for ill, he's going to stamp their policies. On our side, it's going to have to be governors like Walker and members of Congress like Ryan, who helped devise the policies that help the Republicans get back in. I will tell you this, I'm feeling bullish about the 2014 elections because not only does the party that loses have to figure out what the lessons are, the party that wins has to figure out what the lessons are. And this president is overplaying his hand. He thinks he got 53% in 2008, he got 51% last time around, and he thinks he's king of the hill and doesn't need to deal with his political opposition. That is not the way Washington works. It's not the way the Constitution intended. And with a Republican House for the next 4 years, and potentially a Republican Senate for his last 2 years, he better figure out a way to rise above the partisanship of his first term and become a president that is capable of working across party lines. Because otherwise, life is going to be very unpleasant at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue.
We spend so much energy and time teaching our children to not bully one another. I have observed so many times that politicians are bullied by people who don't agree with their views. Example, Scott Walker's private home having protesters outside during a recall fiasco. What advice do you have for any young people who are considering going into politics? How to forge ahead even in the face of bullying?
Get over it. That's what politics, unfortunately. Do I like getting death threats? No. Well, what am I supposed to do about it? You know, if you're Scott Walker and you want to serve the people of your state, and you have a vision that you feel you want to, that you owe it to execute, and somebody shows up beside your house and starts threatening you and upsetting your wife and kids, I mean, I know what happens. He feels sorry for him. He's sorry. He's concerned about it, what's happening to his family. But he can't let it affect, nobody in politics can. Don't participate in that kind of activity. There are legitimate ways to show disagreement. But if you're in politics, you better start to toughen up your skin a little bit. And in a way, that's what the system is built around. You think George Washington was a namby-pamby weenie? You think Abraham Lincoln, as deeply compassionate and caring as he was, here's a man who presided over war in which brother fought brother and 600,000 Americans died. This man was a man of deep emotion. But he had a tough enough skin to pursue his vision of one nation that met the dictates of the Declaration of Independence, a government of, by, and for the people, that gave inalienable rights to every citizen because all men are created equal. Now, fortunately, most of us are not called upon to have as thick a skin as any president is supposed to have, particularly Abraham Lincoln. But in politics, you can't let it dissuade you from the goal. Part of the reason people engage in that kind of behavior is because they think it pays off by discouraging good people from pursuing a cause one side or the other. Now, I don't like ugliness in politics, but let's face it, we're not all polite Iowans. We're not all the polite Scandinavian people. So look at their shoes and tell Ole and Ole jokes. I mean, I have a brother Ole, so I can tell plenty of them. But get over it.
To what do you attribute the widespread miscalculation among prominent conservative political campaigners and pundits this past November?
Gosh. One of whom was me. This is a paradoxical election. From the conservative side, no president's ever been reelected with unemployment rates this high. Nobody's ever been reelected when the economic numbers were as bad as they were. You go back and take a look at these economic forecasters and look at the outcome of the election, and it ain't very, it points to defeat. This was an election that was supposed to have wild enthusiasm. And yet it is the 6th election in American history in which the number of people voting in the presidential election dropped from the previous time. We've had 56 presidential elections. This was the 6th time they dropped from the previous election. And of the previous 5 times, 2 of them were in times of war. 1864, there are fewer voters than 1860. Half the Union left, in case you missed it. 1944, fewer people voted than in 1940. 5-6 million men, women spread across the globe fighting World War II. But this was the election in which everything was supposed to be big turnout. Typically, a president's number in the final polls is the president's number. If you're getting 49 in the final polls, you get 49. You don't get 51. If it's 49.8, you get 49.8, not 51.07, which is what President Obama got. So, you know, I was looking at the economic numbers and I was looking at the president's number. And the president broke it. And I'll tell you how he broke it. He broke it in two ways, one tactical and one strategic. The tactical was he put together a get-out-the-vote operation that was like we had in 2004 and used the internet and tools on the internet to do some really amazing things from a political perspective. Look, everybody does micro-targeting, the sophisticated analysis to sort of identify how likely is anyone to vote and how likely are they to be persuaded to vote for you and what is the cluster of issues that will allow you to get to them. But these guys arranged it by having these information flows of voters, polling data, telephone bank results, door knocks, emails, volunteers, donors, all put into one place in one relational database that they were able to constantly update that score, not use just one score, but every day say who today has become more or less persuadable, who today has become more or less likely to vote, and what is the changing cluster of issues that get to them. This is a very sophisticated, very difficult thing to do. And even more impressive was everybody can micro-target and find out who their targets are and stick somebody on them. Somebody in their neighborhood or somebody in their community or somebody on a phone bank. You know what they did? They took every volunteer and micro-targeted them. And if you signed up as a volunteer and you had a Facebook page and an address book on your computer, it was automatically mined. So they knew everybody on your computer's address book and tagged them on the voter file. So they knew that Joe Jones was known to Susie Smith, the persuadable voter, and so they didn't just sick a volunteer on him. They took Joe Jones, who was an Obama volunteer, whom Susie Smith knew. We call this in the computer business CRM, Customer Relationship Management, and they took it to a new level. That was tactical, and that allowed them to improve on the margins a point or two better than they would have otherwise gotten. And the other one was strategic. In the aftermath of the election, Jim Messina gave a series of interviews to the Washington Post and the New York Times and described the critical moment of the campaign from his perspective, which came in March and April of 2012. He goes to President Obama and says, President Obama, we cannot win on the basis of what you've done. We cannot win on the basis of a prospective vision. We have to make a, quote, grand bet. We have to take 20% of our money, $225 million, and spend it on early television advertising in the battleground states designed to make it impossible for people to vote for Mitt Romney. We have to go at his character. We have to go at his record at Bain. We have to depict him as somebody that the American people simply can't trust in the Oval Office. And they went after him. As my friend Haley Barber said, they painted him as a plutocrat with a wife who was an open, admitted equestrian. I had an interesting conversation in the middle of October with a pal of mine, a big Democrat, a really good guy, straight shooting guy. He said, I've been attending focus groups in Ohio of undecided voters, but when they get to talking about Romney, they're not undecided. They may say they're undecided, but they're never voting for him. Everything they repeat back is exactly what Obama's saying about him. He invested in pioneers and outsourcing jobs to China. He did this, he did that. Just as, whatever the ads were, they've sunk in. They may say they're undecided, but they're not voting for Romney. I said, well, that's interesting. I've had the same kind of experience. I've been going to focus groups in Ohio and among undecided voters, and when they say they're undecided about Obama, they're not really undecided because they say, where's the money gone? Where are the jobs been? What's happening to the deficit? I hate the Affordable Care Act. He told me he was going to be different. He was going to be not red state, blue state, but United States. He turned out to be another typical Chicago Paul. You know, they may say they're undecided, but they're not voting for him. Guess what? We were both right. 400,000 fewer white voters in Ohio in 2012 than in 2008. And if you look at them, they're mostly in white working class neighborhoods in the exurbs, places like Ottawa County to the east and south of Toledo. And these are people who voted for President Obama 4 years ago and said, this time, can't do it, but you know what? I can't vote for that other guy. And it succeeded. I don't think it's healthy. I don't think it's going to give him a great lift going into the second term, but it would. And that's, I think, what helped contribute to this smaller turnout. Barack Obama got 95% of the vote he got in 2008. Mitt Romney got 102% of what John McCain did and lost. That's one weird outcome.
Got time for one more question for you, Karl. It is becoming more or less difficult to find true conservative candidates with the credentials, charisma, or courage to withstand the beating they will face from the co-op leftist media.
Not the question I would have chosen. No, look, the media are on the left, center left. Most of it is unintentional. New York Times, Washington Post, CBS, NBC, ABC, they don't get that they're center left. They don't think that it affects their coverage, but it does. But look, that's the way it is. And you want to cry about it, but you better get out there and articulate the message. Now the good news is that we're no longer controlled by those media. We pay attention to them, but we listen to the AM radio dial, or we go on the internet. We can, Mr. Google can supply us all kinds of information. We make more judgments about it. We make less judgments based on what newspapers tell us. Pew Charitable Trust poll said that in 2008, for the first time, more people said they got more of their information about the presidential campaign from the internet than they got from their newspapers. I don't know if that's healthy or not, because there's no editor on the internet. Barack Obama is not a Muslim. He was born in Hawaii. I don't care if you saw the picture of that thing from Kenya, it's not true. But, having said that, I do think these diverse sources of information and a robust discussion cause us to have a better outcome. But look, the Republicans start out with, Democrats got a head start. Democrats are out there with a media that is sort of in their corner and more likely to talk about the things they want to talk about than the things that we want to talk about. If you watch those Republican presidential debates, you would have thought that the big issues that concerned the country and Republicans were contraception and abortion. I don't know about you, but most of the time the people I talked to in 2011 and 12 were concerned about jobs and the economy and deficits and debt and spending the Affordable Care Act. And yet you watch those presidential debates and it's like, well, I'm from the media, let me ask you an incredible question, pointing you have to be incredibly out of touch with ordinary Americans, because aren't you definitely opposed to contraception in any form, way, shape, or form whatsoever? Like, please. I hope your Wisconsinite, Ryan Spreva, steps in and says, for the 2016 presidential elections, we're not going to surrender control of the Republican presidential primary to the media by allowing there to be 17 or 18 or 19 debates that are going to be, moderated by the media. There ought to be 4 or 5 of them. Let each network have a shot at one, space them out, and then tell the candidates, we're not going to force you to have your message as cheap as it is, just to raise money to show up at the next debate, where you're going to have to go out and run a campaign and convey your message to the voters in the states. But look, that's the way it is. In politics, some people have advantages and some people got disadvantages. Republicans, particularly on a presidential level, have a disadvantage in that the media is generally tilted to the left. Most of them go to the same schools. Most of them, have the same outlook. And look, they're nice people. Many of them are my friends. Well, acquaintances. and they don't get it. I mean, they just don't get it. I mean, there's a wonderful guy named Glenn Johnson who writes for the Boston Globe. You may have seen he's been there for 20 years. He joined John Kerry as his press spokesman at the State Department. I knew he'd never be there for Cole and Powell or Connie Rice. It's just not who he was. Jay Carney of Time Magazine. He was nice guy to be around, fun to be around. But there was no chance in heck he was ever going to go to work as George W. Bush's press spokesman, but there he is, press spokesman for Barack Obama. And if you look at it, it's pretty much a one-way street. For every, 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 of them, there's one Tony Snow. But that's just the way it is. But having said that, that's politics. Now, let me ask you, you got one more that's any better than that? Something upbeat, positive, warm, sensitive.
How do you feel about your attempt to revolutionize political spending, and how in November that was a failure? What is your Republican plan?
I wouldn't have chosen that one either. First of all, I love this. I love this. Okay. The labor unions got their posterior waxed in 2010. Crossroads, the group that I helped found, went out and raised $72 million in 29 weeks in 2010. The biggest player was the SEIU, which spent $87 million, and then, AFSCME, which was $87 million, and $67 million was SEIU. We spent 72. We won a heck of a lot more races than they did. Who said that was a failure and get out of here? We raised $328 million this last time. And yeah, we didn't win the presidential race. And we didn't pick up seats in the Senate. But if we hadn't there, it would have been worse. And we ain't going away. Call it a failure if you like. All I know is that our donors' attitude is beat them next time. And we're going to do that. And, we have a right to. And guess what? We're doing it. I'm really proud of my association with Crossroads. It's run by volunteers. I'm a volunteer. I raise the money. I don't take a dime. I don't take my travel expenses. When I get on a plane and fly out to Los Angeles and walk into an office, I was with a guy I've known for a long time. Went out to call on him. He said, "What do you want?" I said, "I want $2 million. $1 million in 2011 and $1 million in 2012. He said, "Well, I'm impressed with what you did in 2010. Think about it." He said, "I don't mean to be personal, but let me ask you a question. How much of this ends up in your pocket?" I said, "Not a dime. In fact, I paid for my airplane ticket to come out and see you." He said, "Interesting." A couple days later, he sent us $2 million. I have a guy who gave us $32.5 million. You know why? Because he said, "I'm sick and tired of people picking my pocket, and now I'm associated with a group that's going to put money on the target." So we're around. That guy, the morning after the election, about 6 o'clock, I'm in New York, Fox, getting ready to go on Fox and Friends. You can imagine how enthusiastic I was to go on television. And I see the phone, and it's this guy, and he's out on the West Coast, and he's like, okay. Pick up the phone, and he literally says to me, first words out of his mouth, "Kiddo, beat him next time." And that's the attitude of these people. They don't want anything except a country full of opportunity and prosperity that they've enjoyed. Got an 80-year-old guy who gave us like $22.5 million. He said, "I'm not going to be around to see how this money's going to be, what effect it'll have." He said, "I'm doing this because I trust the group. I trust your organization." Had another 80-year-old guy gave us like $17 million. He said, my wife and I were talking about this. Our kids are okay. He said, "No, I've got girls. They're okay. They're set for life. They're set, they and their families." He said, "I got a son who thinks everything I made is his, but it isn't. He'll be all right." He said, "You may not know this about my wife. My wife teaches at college, and she teaches history. And she said to me that, great nations don't rise or fall inexorably. They rise or fall based on the character of their people." And she said, "Bob, it's time to show our character. That's why I'm giving you this money." So you're around people like that, you can't help but have confidence in the future of our country. We are a great country. I don't care what side of the aisle you're on. This is a great country to live in. I don't care how difficult things. You want to get depressed, let me get talking about the deficit and spending and the fiscal picture of the country. I will make you blue in the face. But you know what? I'm optimistic. Because this is the greatest country on the face of the planet. No ifs, ands, or buts. And I like participating in this great drama. And I hope you do too. Regardless of whether you're Republican or Democrat, vegetarian, prohibitionist, anti-Mason, I don't care. This is a great country, and we all ought to participate in shaping its future. Thanks for having me.